Israel's genocide in Gaza, but Israeli settler colonialism, the ongoing Nakba, all these things are actually very much related to the U.S. state, to the U.S. society, to U.S. history, to the U.S. today, to the explicit emergence of fascism in U.S. politics and society. These fascist projects are going to be destructive not only for these immediate victims, but for everyone. This necessitates as broad alliances as possible. And this is so urgent. We don't have time. We never really had time, but now that's it. Now we have no more time at all.
Welcome to episode 248 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism works to unite all who can be united to join in mass nonviolent protests and resistance in the streets and throughout society, growing to include millions and refusing to stop until we create such a profound political crisis that Trump cannot impose his fascist program or even maintain his hold on power. Big thanks to our patrons, everyone who rates, reviews, shares the show, and reps our merch. Every bit helps connect more people with Refuse Fascism. If you haven't yet, take a second to leave a review, share the show, or hit up our merch store, of course, after listening to today's episode. Today, we're sharing an interview with Dr. Raz Segal. Dr. Segal is an associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and endowed professor in the study of modern genocide at Stockton University, where he also serves as director of the Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. But first, this week in fascism.
Your Secretary of State says everyone who's here, citizens and non-citizens, deserve due process. Do you agree, Mr. President?
I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know.
Well, the Fifth Amendment says
I don't know. It seems it might say that, but if you're talking about that, then we'd have to have 1 million or 2 million or 3 million trials. We have thousands of people that are some murderers and some drug dealers and some of the worst people on earth. Some of the worst, most dangerous people on earth. And I was elected to get them the hell out of here, and the courts are holding me from doing it.
But even given those numbers that you're talking about, don't you need to uphold the Constitution of the United States as president?
I don't know.
This week, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, during a Senate committee hearing, said that Kilmer Abrego Garcia, quote unquote, will not be coming back, despite a Supreme Court order that said the government needed to facilitate his return. Stephen Miller floated the suspension of habeas corpus, the fundamental right to challenge one's detention by the government.
Well, the Constitution is clear, and that, of course, is the supreme law of the land, that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in a time of invasion. So I would say that's an option we're actively looking at. Look, a lot of it depends on whether the courts do the right thing or not.
So let's break this down. The Trump fascist regime has openly threatened to suspend one of the most basic constitutional protections, habeas corpus, unless the courts stop ruling against it. Straight up, give us what we want, or we'll just ignore the Constitution. Habeas corpus is a cornerstone of democratic rights going all the way back to the Magna Carta. It's what protects people from being locked up indefinitely without cause. It gives anyone, citizen or not, the right to go before a judge and challenge the lawfulness of their detention. Without it, the government could jail people with no explanation, no hearing, and no way out. This threat is part of a bigger push by the Trump regime to speed up deportations and remove legal checks on its power, especially in immigration cases. Take the case of Ramisa Oztur, for example. Her lawyers filed an emergency habeas petition saying her detention being ripped off the streets and thrown in a van was unconstitutional. Yeah, a federal judge agreed, ruling in her favor. That ruling was a direct challenge to the idea that this regime can do whatever it wants with no judicial oversight. This week, Romisa was released. The legal basis of their supposed quote-unquote right to suspend our rights is the regime's insistence that the country is being invaded, a claim that they have already raised in court to justify abductions and deportations to El Salvador's death camp. The courts have denied this claim so far, but with each passing day, a leap from here to there gets smaller and shorter, more of a hop or a skip than a jump. Let's be crystal clear. There is no quote-unquote invasion at the southern border, only a catchword to weaponize emergency powers over whole peoples that this regime declares not deserving rights. The regime's goal here is to bulldoze past the courts, past the Constitution, and set the stage for locking people up for dissent, for opposing the regime or their policies, or for simply existing without documentation or being born outside these borders. In relation to this, Stephen Miller went on at length about how, in their view, all immigration matters are entirely walled off from the judicial branch, a distortion of an already disturbing reality that for decades, routine immigration matters have been relegated to Justice Department officials who themselves, quote-unquote, judges without a shred of independence from those seeking detention and deportations. Miller's statements clearly show their intent to exploit this issue to use, quote-unquote, immigration as a method to entirely circumvent the legal system of the United States. By painting the judiciary as the enemy, this regime is laying the groundwork for a regime that answers to no one. And let's be real, suspending habeas corpus wouldn't just target non-citizens, it sets a precedent for the arbitrary detention of anyone seen as a threat to this regime. The stakes for the rule of law and civil and democratic rights couldn't be higher. This is yet another reason why we must demand Trump must go now. As they lay down the justification for using immigration tools to strip basic rights from everyone within the borders of the United States, ICE and their allies in local police departments are beginning to arrest citizens for opposing this power grab. The federal government is claiming that Democratic lawmakers, quote-unquote, stormed the gate and, quote-unquote, broke into a new ICE facility in Newark, New Jersey. The law clearly states that federal lawmakers are permitted to enter without prior notice. Quote, any facility operated by or for the Department of Homeland Security used to detain or otherwise house aliens, end quote. Through accusing lawmakers of breaking into a facility they have every right to be in, Homeland Security is making clear that they themselves were in fact in breach of federal law simply by preventing the lawmakers' entrance. But that doesn't faze the fascists who believe the law only exists to serve their ends. A DHS assistant secretary claimed on CNN that ICE had footage that could lead to the arrests of the lawmakers and explicitly threatened them on live national television. While those members, Representatives Bonnie Watson-Coleman, Rob Menendez, and LaMonica McIver, were physically restrained and then escorted off the grounds, the mayor of Newark, Ras Baraka, was arrested by federal agents for his presence, protesting the ICE facility and claiming that they did not have proper building permits. This is what fascism looks like. Listen to Representative Menendez speaking at a press conference following this completely ominous, illegitimate arrest of Mayor Ras Baraka.
ICE brought to meet the mayor of Newark over 20 armed individuals. 20 armed individuals to confront the mayor of Newark, along with 3 members of Congress. It was an act of intimidation. It was an act of intimidation not just to the mayor, not just to us, but to everyone watching. We know what ICE has been doing in our communities. We know that the president lied and this administration lies every day when they're saying they're going after criminals. It is not true. They feel no weight of the law. They feel no restraint on what they should be doing. And that was shown in broad daylight today when they not just arrested the mayor of Newark, but when they put their hands on 2 members of Congress who are standing behind me. How is this acceptable to anyone in this country? How is this acceptable? I fight along with these 2 incredible women every day for the people of New Jersey. We fight for the country that we should be. What we saw today is the country that we live in under Donald Trump and his Department of Homeland Security, under his ICE, does not reflect who we are as a country. It reflects everything wrong with the moment.
As they arrest a mayor of a major city, ICE has been terrorizing, raiding, arresting, and threatening people nationwide, with cruelty escalating again and again and again. In California, where ICE raids have overwhelmed communities, according to the SF Gate, 2 children were left stranded at a gas station when ICE took their father. ICE has threatened at least 7 restaurants in Washington, D.C., demanding employment records. In Hawaii, where ICE has arrested 50 people in raids across 3 islands, they detained and interrogated educators participating in a federally funded foreign teacher exchange program. Meanwhile, the local police brutally jumped into action when residents were nonviolently attempting to stop a warrantless ICE arrest of a new grandmother on the tree-lined streets of Worcester, Massachusetts. Police held a young girl's face to the ground as ICE snatched away her mother. ICE got away, 2 locals were violently arrested, and the fascist partners in the mainstream media regurgitated vague government claims that the person ICE took was a criminal who had been arrested, not convicted, but merely arrested in the past. We all feel it. The atrocities are relentless. Another right snatched away. Someone else disappeared. Due process shredded. Law firms targeted. Universities attacked. Books banned. Immigrants shipped to overseas forever prisons. Trump promises to disappear homegrowns. Next, trans people banned from the military. It feels impossible to keep up. But here's the truth. We're not going to win by chasing every new outrage one by one. We can't afford to be constantly playing defense while this fascist juggernaut steamrolls over rights, lives, and the rule of law. And we can't wait for 2026 or 2028 or for someone else to step in. There is a way to stop this, a way to defeat this fascist regime, but it takes all of us stepping in and stepping up. It's time to go on the offense, to come together and inject the demand. Trump must go now into every arena of resistance, into every protest, and every moment of defiance. Together, we can forge a mighty force to stop the regime from carrying out its horrific fascist assault on the people here and around the world. On Thursday, May 15th, this Thursday, I encourage everyone to join protests outside of the Supreme Court of the United States at 9 a.m. This protest has been called for by Refuse Fascism, and I encourage people to take action wherever you are. If you can't be in D.C., to say hands off birthright citizenship. For those who might recall, I talked about it last week, the Supreme Court is hearing a case this Thursday that could end nationwide injunctions blocking Trump's order targeting birthright citizenship. These injunctions issued by judges in 3 states are really the only thing stopping ICE from tearing families apart while legal cases play out. If SCOTUS overturns them, birthright citizenship could disappear for most of the country overnight. And with it, a floodgate opens for even more attacks on entire communities and more rights. This is a direct assault on the Constitution, the rule of law, and very much so the separation of powers. It's a key step towards locking in fascist rule. And it's up to us, the people, to say no in the name of humanity. We refuse to accept a fascist America. Hands off birthright citizenship. The Trump fascist regime must go now. Then, this upcoming Saturday, May 17th, join with others across the country to make a big leap in projecting this demand, Trump must go now, to the tens of millions who are heartsick and furious about all Trump is doing. Let them see there is a movement for them to join, a movement with a real strategy to win. Keep raising this demand all summer long, including at the nationwide protest called for June 14th, No King's Day. If we act with courage and heart, if we unite all who can be united from diverse political perspectives, we have the numbers and the power to reclaim the future in the name of humanity. For more on May 15th and May 17th National Days of Action called for by refusefascism.org, see the show notes. This week, the Israeli government openly and officially clarified their intent to ethnically cleanse Gaza for good. The fascist movement consolidating power in the United States is ecstatic about this outcome. The connections between the genocide in Gaza and the ascendance of fascism in the U.S. run deep, and neither can be fully confronted without confronting both. With that, here is my interview with Dr. Raz Segal. Today, I have the profound honor of talking with Dr. Raz Segal. Dr. Segal is an associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University, where he also directs the Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies program. In 2024, Dr. Segal was set to lead the University of Minnesota's Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, but the university rescinded the job offer because he correctly characterized the Israeli assault as quote-unquote textbook case of genocide. He is one of the co-authors of an open letter from South Jersey, Silence is Collaboration, Academics Must Speak Out Against Fascism, published by LitHub in early April and signed by Stel. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much, Sam. Thanks for the invitation and for this opportunity to speak with you.
You've written extensively about the role of intent in genocide, and the events of this past week with Israel announcing its intention to totally conquer Gaza have really pushed that issue to the fore. You might think that mass murder is bad enough, so who cares what they intend to do? But what do people need to understand about intent? What does that tell us? And does understanding their intentions impact what must be done to stop the horror?
I think that we've all been witnessing now for over a year and a half Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza unfold in front of our eyes, on our screens. This is really the first time that we see genocide unfold in this way, the way in which it's documented in real time by victims, by the perpetrators. Think about the thousands of videos of Israeli soldiers and officers from Gaza, and then also by other people, healthcare workers, doctors, humanitarian workers. And we're talking about unprecedented levels of destruction. What more is there to say? Of course, it's very important to understand the intent of perpetrators of mass atrocities, and in this case, very clearly genocide. And in this case, they have expressed their intent from the very beginning, actually, and ongoing until today, as you said. I mean, Netanyahu just laid it out very clearly, the intent to turn Gaza now explicitly actually into a concentration camp. That is a very, very small area of Gaza into a concentration camp, and basically to implement the so-called Trump plan of forcibly making life hell for Palestinians in Gaza, which Israel has already done, right? Life is hell. Palestinians and Palestinian children are not facing starvation in Gaza. Israel is starving Palestinians in Gaza for a long, long, long time. This starving Palestinians in Gaza as a process began actually well before 7th of October 2023. And expressions of genocidal intent, which we see actually with the Israeli leadership, again, also before October 2023, after October 2023, have exploded. It's very important to understand this. I don't think that there's actually any misunderstanding about this. There are people who think that this is terrific, this kind of settler colonial project. Now we see very clearly in front of our eyes that Israel's attack on Gaza is really Israeli settler colonialism taken to its logical conclusion. I mean, the greater Israeli idea, maximum territory, minimum or no Palestinians. And then there are, of course, people who think that this is terrible. And the question has been for this last year and a half, and if we think about more than a year and a half, think about here in the US, what to do. I mean, it's not by accident, I think, by coincidence, that almost everywhere I have talked, met with students, other kinds of audiences, almost always the first question is, okay, what do we do? Yes, it's very important to understand this intention. I think that it was clear very early on, actually. It was clear in October 2023. That's why I published that piece in Jewish Currents on 13th of October. And the question then was, and the question still remains, what can we do to stop this? Just to stop this at this point. And then, of course, what can we do in order to continue to struggle for a different kind of future? A different kind of future, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, in Palestine, Israel, for everyone who's there, Jews, Palestinians, others. What can we do to struggle for a future of truth and justice, for accountability? And when we delve into these issues, I think that we also see that these questions are relevant to thinking about our own society here in the US. And this is, I think, where addressing this question of what can we do becomes urgent, so that people understand understand that this is not just about thinking about a faraway place where a lot of people have no connection to, or they don't know anything about it actually, even though it might be a lot in the news. But the issues that we're discussing, the relationship of their country, the US, to that place, Israel's genocide in Gaza, but Israeli settler colonialism, the ongoing Nakba, all these things are actually very much related to the US state, to the US society, to US history, to the US today, to the explicit emergence of fascism in US politics and society today. And I hope that's one way to get people here in the US to think about what can we do.
As you were talking, I was wondering for audience members that aren't as immersed in this topic, whether you'd briefly, I'm sure you could do a whole class on it, but briefly explain settler colonialism as Israel's project.
Sure. When I say settler colonialism, I mean, we can think about this in a very simple way, actually. The project of people, a group of people, to settle from somewhere else, to settle them in a certain place, instead of people who had lived in that place for a very long time. In that sense, it's of course a project of dispossession, mass robbery, elimination, destruction. But from a settler colonial perspective, from the perspective of the settlers, of course, it's a constructive project because the indigenous people, the people who had lived in the place, in this case, we're talking about Palestine, right? If we're talking about Israeli settler colonialism, the indigenous Palestinian population are perceived as, barbarians without connection to the land, without history, without, these kinds of ideas. Now, in order to understand specifically, and of course, settler colonialism is a defining element of European empire building around the world since it really began in the late 15th century and onwards. And then, of course, obviously, the US is a settler colonial state, Canada is a settler colonial state, Australia is a settler colonial state, New Zealand, we can think about South Africa, and, many other cases, very different cases, one from the other, of course. There's also similarities. But when we think about the issue of Zionism and settler colonialism, Israeli settler colonialism, we would do well to listen to Zionists. The one text that always is important here is Zev Jabotinsky's, the father of revisionist right-wing Zionism, is seminal text from 1923, The Iron Wall, which is easy to find in English translation on the Jabotinsky Institute website. This is a text that really is kind of an internal conversation that Jabotinsky is having with left-wing Zionists. This is 1923, right? The premise is that Zionism is absolutely settler colonialist because Jabotinsky says to his imaginary left-wing Zionist interlocutors, he says, look, we want to build a state in a place where people live. And he calls them the indigenous Palestinian. And he asks his left-wing Zionists, he says, do you know of any case of colonialism in the world where the indigenous population accepted the colonizer? And it's a rhetorical question. Yeah, he says, of course, there isn't such a case. There's always resistance to the destruction of indigenous societies. There will be in this case as well. And we deserve to do this. And therefore, he says, either we don't do this, Zionism has to stop, or proceed regardless of the indigenous Palestinian population. Today, last fall, right outside of the Gaza Strip in a closed military zone, we had a gathering of settler leaders, including Israeli parliament members, including Israeli government ministers, who titled their gathering, Planning to Settle Gaza. The main issue of discussion was the complete destruction of northern Gaza and the building of a new Israeli Jewish city on the ruins of Gaza City. All this doesn't require a degree in comparative literature. We just have to listen. In this case, of course, Palestinians have been talking about Israeli settler colonialism since the 50s. It was only in the 90s when others starting to talk about Israeli settler and Zionism settler colonialism that it really gained much more attention within and outside the academic world. But we should listen to Zionists telling us then and now that Israel is a settler colonial project. It aspires to a greater Israel idea, that is maximum territory between the river and the sea, and minimum, or ideally, no Palestinians. This is what a very important scholar also of Palestine, Israel, the late historian Alon Confino, described as creating a Zionist imagination of Palestine, Israel, without Palestinians. So this is, in a nutshell, thinking about Israeli settler colonialism. But again, one thing to say here that's very important, and this also explains, in my view, the levels of support by the U.S. for Israel, certainly after 1967, because Israel is a settler colonial state. And if the U.S. has supported Israel for so long as a settler colonial state, and if we come to terms with this reality that is blurred, that is marginalized, that is denied, even though it's in our face, then we also have to come to terms with settler colonialism here, which is also marginalized, denied, blurred, disavowed, even though it's in our face. So I think the reality of settler colonialism here and there is very, very important in understanding U.S. support for Israel. That doesn't mean that many other elements, strategic U.S. interest in the Middle East, arms deals, of course, money, corruption, if we think about Trump's interests now in the Arab world and so on and so forth, all of this is part of the picture, of course, in the past and in the present. But I think that there's an ideological issue here that is at the core really of white supremacy and of Jewish supremacy as an element of white supremacy in the Israeli case, settler colonialism, that without it, we can't really understand how across the political divides that we imagine about the U.S. left, right, Democrats, Republicans, Trump, Biden, what have you, we see this really continuous support of Israel in its crude violations of international law, occupation, mass violence against Palestinians for decades and decades and decades. And then, of course, after October 7th, I think there has never been a president like President Biden that has supported Israel now in its full-fledged genocidal stage of settler colonialism in a way that, of course, makes the Biden administration absolutely complicit in Israeli genocide.
Thanks for that breakdown, Raz. I think none of this would be possible without the United States. And I think that the stepping back that you did earlier about where this comes from and the thread that follows the story, I think the ideological component of it is extremely important when also looking at what we face in Trump and for lack of a better word, the synergy between the fascist state of Israel and the fascist state of Trump. I'm thinking about the genocide in Gaza that's unfolded against this backdrop of a battle over American democracy, where, as you said in your own words, both parties support and facilitate the genocide. And yet it seems only one, the fascist party, the Republican Party, for those who are not clear, reap the political rewards. And we're moving from a situation where colonial violence enabled and underwrote democracy and certain rights in the heart of the empire to a situation where colonial violence is driving and even necessitating repressive violence in the imperial core, just thinking about the universities. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on what's factored into this.
I think this brings to mind questions, of course. You mentioned the struggle for democracy here in the U.S. Thinking about fascism or fascist tendencies in the U.S. and in Israel, it really calls into question, of course, how we tend to think about democracy. U.S. democracy, of course, Israeli democracy. I really can't see any way in which Israel has ever been a democracy, right? A democracy doesn't hold hundreds of thousands of people under military rule. I'm talking about, the Palestinians who remained within the territory that became Israel after the 1948 war and the Nakba. These 156,000 Palestinians who became citizens of the state of Israel, immediately were seen basically as, in effect, enemies and were placed under military rule until 1966. And then, of course, we have the 1967 war and the occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. And then we have military occupation over millions of people. So, democracies are not states that deprive people under their rule, millions of people, for decades and decades and decades of basic rights. So I really can't see in any way how Israel, and this is just quite apart from any other discussion, how anyone can see Israel at any point in time as a democracy is really just very, very strange. The only way to do that, of course, is complete dehumanization of Palestinians, which is structural in Israeli state and society from the very beginning, which is now, of course, after October 7th, exploded in frightening. Anyone who follows Hebrew language media after 7th of October has been subject to an avalanche of celebrations of mass murder, dehumanization of Palestinians. Horrific prophetic, images and language, which can only understand if you understand that this is embedded in Israeli state and society for a long, long time before October 2023. And then when we think about, again, also the U.S. as a democracy, even after the formal end of slavery, what's clear is that the U.S. was a constitutional republic. We can say that the U.S. was a constitutional republic, but, and this is the issue now, right, that we're seeing very clearly, unashamed, explicit, open attack on the U.S. Constitution. This is all in our face. This is what's, I think, remarkable in what we're seeing today. There's not even an attempt to make any of this secret. Whether we're thinking about the attack by the current Trump administration on birthright citizenship, including, by the way, if people remember in the early days of this second Trump administration, it's only been 100 and a bit. It seems like, I don't know, 1 million. But in the early days of the second Trump administration, the attack on birthright citizenship was, and still is, I think, very much aimed actually on indigenous people. There were even ICE raids against indigenous people in Arizona in these early days. Or whether we're thinking about the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, so that this conflation of a people and a state of Jews in Israel, so that any criticism of Israeli policies and violence against Palestinians becomes anti-Semitism, whether we're looking at the use for this purpose of the definition of anti-Semitism by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IRA definition, or whether we're looking at the Project Esther document, part of the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, the section that deals with the plan to combat anti-Semitism, and how that is defined in Project Esther is that anti-Semitism is anything that is anti-Israeli, anti-Zionist, and anti-American, which is interesting that Jews don't figure in this kind of formulation of anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-American. But also in this kind of, weaponization, criticism of Israel becomes anti-Semitism, and there's an attempt to legislate this on state levels, but also the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act on the federal level. All of this is a crude assault on First Amendment rights, right? I mean, if I criticize Russia's attack on Ukraine and say that it includes genocidal elements, which I think it does, no one says that this is a racist attack against Russians, which it isn't, but it's a very legitimate critique of Russian policies and violence against Ukrainians. This kind of attack on the U.S. Constitution today, or related to this, of course, the attack on the court system that we're seeing unfolding in front of our eyes, where the government in various ways is disobeying court orders, including Supreme Court orders. Step by step, sometimes it's losing, sometimes it's backtracking, sometimes it works. With every time that the government manages to get away with disobeying court orders or to, stretch the process more, the court system crumbles a little bit more. The fact that the U.S. was always a constitutional republic, and the Constitution is really what the president promises everyone when they become president to protect, this really now shows us, again, in our face, that we are actually facing a fascist assault. And then the kind of, back in the Israeli case, if at the beginning of Israel's assault on Gaza, in October, November, Israel was, saying, under the Shifa hospital, there was a Hamas headquarters. And then, of course, no evidence whatsoever, right? But there was this whole discussion around it. Now Israel doesn't even try to make any of those claims. And now it is explicit about its plan to forcibly remove all Palestinians from Gaza, destroy the Gaza Strip. Again, settler colonialism, outright, explicit. This Jewish supremacist fascist idea of the state is now in our face. So the white supremacist fascist idea is in our face here in the US. The Jewish supremacist fascist idea of Israel is in our face there. So again, what to do is something that we need to think about, more broadly. We need to think very much about stopping this genocide in Gaza, which is unbelievably urgent. But we also need to understand that it's related to a broader, really a global issue today. And we can say more about this, but this connection is, I think, very, very important.
Because you brought it up a couple times, I wanted to pose directly, what do you think needs to be done in this moment of rising fascism in its most overt form, and at a time where people are seeing this undisguised white supremacy in the United States, undisguised male supremacy in the United States, undisguised and unabashed, Christian supremacy and American hegemony? You look at Israel and you also see this undisguised fascist state. People see that. And I still think, I welcome your thoughts and disagreement on this, but I still think that there's it's approaching. There's some similarities. It might need to be reined in. And I think still a lot of thinking that there's some kind of referee or reset button that is just going to bring it back to whatever things were before. And how do we get people, how can we stop that in this climate, both with what's actually happening, which is quite clearly fascist acceleration, and people still either saying or by their actions saying, I don't need to do anything yet.
Yeah, there's a couple of things to say about this. First of all, one of the things that we need to do, we, that is everyone, whatever their position is, whatever they do in life, in their relationships, interactions, in their lives, one thing is to insist on documented reality, what we call truth, in front of our eyes today, but then also what we know about very important elements of what we call, say, post-war or post-Holocaust history, post-Holocaust, post-war world, right? Because the promise of the world after the Holocaust, the promise of the world after Nazism was never again. The promise of the world was a world where we will have genocide prevention. The promise of the world was a world of human rights, respect for human rights. But that didn't happen at all from the very beginning. What do I mean by this? You don't have to be a Holocaust scholar, a genocide scholar, a historian to understand and to learn and to know some very basic elements of this world that are very important in terms of thinking what to do, this question of what to do from different perspectives, because obviously this is a burning issue, and I'll get to this in a second, for everyone actually, across all kinds of divides. This is very important across all kinds of divides. Again, I'll get to this as well, because the people who need to engage in this struggle are not going to agree on a lot of things. So we'll get to this. It's a very important point. But these elements of the post-war, post-Holocaust world really are that we haven't been actually living in a post-Holocaust world. What do I mean by this? If we think about the major kind of processes of mass violence, structures of mass violence, systems of mass violence that led us to Nazism and the Holocaust, we can think about the exclusionary nation-state system and settler colonialism, white supremacy. These issues, these processes, these structures were not challenged after World War II, after the Holocaust. They were actually reproduced. The exclusionary nation-state system in Europe and actually across the post-colonial world were kind of reproduced. Also, of course, in the Israeli state, right? So the creation of the Israeli state as an exclusionary nation-state for the Jews was perceived as the solution, quote unquote, to the Jewish problem after the Nazis, right? The Nazis wanted to annihilate the Jews as a final solution to the Jewish problem. Now it would be a state for the Jews, but reproduced part of the problem that led us to Nazism and the Holocaust. But also in the Israeli case, it overlapped with the reproduction actually of settler colonialism and colonialism. Israel is actually exactly at the intersection of the exclusionary nation-state system and settler colonialism, the settler state. But this is around the world. Obviously, the winning powers, the US, remained a settler state, obviously. And of course, Israel was created through the 1948 Nakba, that is the destruction of Palestinian and Palestinian society in Palestine. The same year, 1948, where we have the emergence of the Genocide Convention, right? When we think about what this world at the intersection of the nation-state system and settler colonialism has created, it has created, of course, a lot of genocidal violence and mass atrocities, but it has created today more than 120 million forcibly displaced people around the world. Now, you can view on the UN website how many more forcibly displaced people are added to the statistics, every 10 minutes, every hour. How many of them are children, legally speaking, that is under the age of 18, all kinds of data. It's all on the UN website. But there's more than 120 million forcibly displaced people today around the world. This is more than 3 times the number of forcibly displaced people at the end of World War II. So it's certainly not a post-Holocaust world of respect for human rights and genocide prevention. And of course, this number of people points to a structural, this is not like, we have a problem. This is a structural problem in the international legal and political system. So the first thing is to insist on the truth, right? And I say this now also as a scholar, a person who teaches in a university, right? A place that's supposed to be committed to documented reality, to research, to teaching, insisting on the truth, insisting on saying the truth, writing the truth. When we teach, when we write, when we talk with others, in any situation, today is very, very important. We know that it's very important because otherwise we wouldn't see such an attack the way that we see today on the US academic world, because those in power, identify the truth as a real threat. So that's the first thing, if you ask me what to do, not to self-censor. And I say this also, as just think about the base Holocaust studies, Holocaust denial, right? The struggle against Holocaust denial. All these things are based on what we might say today has become a radical act to insist on documented reality in front of us. Sometimes these discussions seem like we're standing outside in the middle of the day and someone is saying, well, it's the middle of the night. And now we have to pretend like these are legitimate positions. We all have our perspectives, our opinions. No, we don't. We absolutely don't. If it's the middle of the day, there's only one legitimate perspective about this, that it's the middle of the day, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is, in relation to that, of course, is the kind of alliances that we can create. And again, this could be, people can engage in insisting on the truth, and people can engage in various ways of acting in response to what's going on, various ways, but it all depends on creating alliances. We're not going to achieve anything alone. For Americans, this is, I think, a very, very difficult issue, right? Because American individualism, this kind of ultra-capitalist approach, is very embedded in the way that many Americans imagine their lives, which is, of course, contrary to how humans have always lived, right? We can't do anything. So creating alliances, and here we get to this thing that I think is really, really at the crux of the issue. What to do depends on how we can create these alliances. Now, there are some things that we cannot compromise on, absolutely, right? But there are a lot of things that we are absolutely able to compromise on. And I always say, and this is not only about the left, people tend to think that, the left, there's always an internal struggles within the left. No, it's also in the right. It's just the way people are. But I always say that, okay, we hate each other and we want to kill each other sometimes, people who we need to collaborate with. And that's okay. Let's make sure that we get to the other side of this really unprecedented challenge and attack that we're facing. And then on the other side, we'll kill each other. That's fine, right? But if we don't get to the other side, we don't get to kill each other, right? So what I think is very important for people to understand is not just these connections that, we mentioned here between the US and Israel. And that's why I mentioned more than 120 million forcibly displaced people around the world. We know today that if we think about really the key challenge that we all face, which is global warming and environmental destruction and climate change, we're looking at forecasts in the next 30, 40 years. So in our lifetime, and certainly in the lifetime of our children, of hundreds of millions of people on the move around the world. And it might be much more, actually, because about half of humanity today lives in places where people won't be able to continue living because of the rise of the sea levels, clean water, just too hot. And this includes, by the way, Palestine and Israel. Guess what? In 30, 40, 50 years, no one might be able to live there in Palestine, Israel. So if we're thinking now about these fascist projects, white supremacy, Jewish supremacy, Greater Israel Project, this kind of ideas that are based on extreme and violent exclusionary policies about borders, fences, all these kinds of things, this is not going to work for the vast majority of people. Again, this is something that is very easy for people to deny also, even though we all see the US as already a site of unbelievable forced internal displacement as a result of climate all the time. Now, this comes back to the fact that if people understand the connection between, indeed, if we think about forcibly displaced people, Nakba Palestinians, right? If we think about climate displacement, if we think about how these fascist projects are going to be destructive, not only for these immediate victims, but for everyone, for ourselves, right? This necessitates as broad alliances as possible. And this is so urgent. We cannot continue to operate in a way in which these alliances are so difficult and so problematic. The focus is immediately diverted from the struggle to a million other things. We just can't. We don't have time. We never really had time. But now that's it. Now we have no more time at all. So what to do, right? What to do is based on these two, in my view, these two conditions within which we will then think together what to do, insisting on the truth and building alliances with whoever we can build, whatever furthers the goal of the struggle. That is to stop this genocide, to struggle against people. And we have to understand, to struggle against forces, governments, ideologies that ultimately want to destroy our lives, to see really how our fate is connected. In that sense, how Gaza is our future. Israel has murdered more than 17,000 children in Gaza, at least, probably more. 17,000 children, tens of thousands of Palestinians, but more than 17,000 children. We should all be urgently concerned about Palestinians in Gaza, but we should also understand this is the vision of our future. And I think that if we understand that, so we have to admit some truth. We have to insist on these documented realities, past and present. But then this sense of urgency should really drive the way, change actually in radical ways, I think. And that's a different discussion, how we organize to respond, because our organizing so far has, at the very least, not been sufficient.
Absolutely agree. You spoke powerfully to, I think, many layers of this, the interconnection and the urgency in particular. And one of the things that compelled me personally to be part of Refuse Fascism and part of founding it in Trump's first term, right after he won, was the slogan, "In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. Not me and my people, or those people over there, or a section that is attacked, or for America, or for democracy," but understanding that as a whole, humanity is imperiled, the planet itself as well, or the ability for life to exist on this planet. The rock may go on. And the idea that what happens here, for better or for worse, makes an outsized impact for the rest of the world, including the people of Gaza, but not only. And so I think that what you were speaking to just resonates very, very deeply. And I'm wondering, one of the things that, to me, the genocide in Gaza has done is increasingly delegitimizing global institutions in the eyes of millions around the world. To me, it's like exposing the emptiness of a lot of international law, notions of academic freedom, and, as you hinted at earlier, notions of American democracy. I'm wondering, what can history tell us about what you see coming next for these institutions and these ideas?
Yeah, because there's a lot to say about this. But of course, international law, how is it? Who would have imagined that this would be more than a year and a half, this unfolding genocide? Again, the first ever live stream genocide in this way. It has exposed, as you said, we have 3 provisional ruling of the International Court of Justice in the case that South Africa brought against Israel on the charge of genocide. And the court, in the majority of judges, 3 times have said that Israel is plausibly perpetrating genocide. Of course, the final decision of the court will take 5, 6, 7, 8 years more. But there's 3 provisional measures ruling. There's arrest warrants by the International Criminal Court on war crimes and crimes against humanity, not genocide yet at this point, but against Netanyahu and former Israeli defense, really war minister Yoav Gallant. And yet the genocide continues, intensifies actually. I mean, Israel's attack after it broke whatever remained of the ceasefire in March has been, unbelievably intense. So this has, as you said, has exposed what is the meaning of international law anymore. If we think about international law, it's important to explain that we shouldn't only be thinking of this as kind of like a structure of an international body disconnected from societies and people on the ground. And this is where the issue of what do we do, your mobilizing comes in, because there's an argument, and a very strong argument actually, to be made that the wave of protests in support of Gaza and against Israel's unfolding genocide, and back in the fall of 2023, across the world, played a role in pushing South Africa to bring the charge of genocide against Israel in the International Court of Justice. So mobilizing on the ground is very, very significant, also in order to create change in the international legal system. And what we're already seeing, we're definitely in a massive crisis in the international legal system, but we're also in a process of unbelievable change in the international legal system, because the international legal system was actually, if we understand that international law is always international politics, it's intermeshed, then the international legal system that was recreated after World War II with genocide as its key innovation, the new crime. But again, if we understand, as I said, that we never were living in a post-Holocaust world, the international legal system was never actually meant to be in a position of a charge of genocide against Israel in the International Court of Justice. It was never meant to issue arrest warrants by the International Criminal Court against Israel. In many ways, as genocide scholar Dirk Moses has argued in his recent book on the problems of genocide, the concept of genocide, but we can say by extension the international legal system, was always actually designed horribly to provide license for state violence. for the reproduction, actually, of the exclusionary nation-state system and the process and structures of settler colonialism. It still continue. But here we are. There is a charge of genocide against Israel in the ICJ. There are arrest warrants in the ICC. And remember that when the chief prosecutor of the ICC, Karim Khan, who was a major figure before October 2023 in maintaining the international legal system as it was with impunity for Israel, when he requested the arrest warrants back in May 2024, he also had this video announcement where he says himself that he is issuing these arrest warrants also because if we don't now show that the international law applies to everyone, that we cannot continue actually with impunity, in other words, or in other words, that the international legal system has to change, then it all comes crumbling down. And we have to understand that the US government and the Israeli government want international law to go away. And that's also a mark of fascist takeover, creating basically a lawless society. That is actually authoritarian control. There is no law, or the law is only something that the rulers can use for their own benefit. People are subject to this basically arbitrary rule, and we're seeing it now in the US. As we saw in front of our eyes, people kidnapped off the streets, the government disobeying the courts, these sorts of things. So also on the international level, if we understand that the US government and the Israeli government want the international legal system to go away, then we all should understand that we want it to stay in place, actually, and change. So the struggle is to maintain the international legal system and insist on changing it. Even now in the steep crisis, where we are sometimes feel completely powerless, right? How is it that we're facing this for more than a year and a half now? There is change, right? And we need to continue pushing this change forward. The issue, again, is we need to factor into this, if to go back to, my point about how this affects everyone. A lawless international system is something that furthers lawless national systems, furthers the fascist takeover. And if we really take seriously the threat that we all face by global warming and climate change, then an international legal order is so important in the kind of global response that we need for this challenge, because we do need it. What I'm saying, in other words, here is that sometimes there's a lot of anger, very justified anger, at activist circles from below in society, anger or sometimes powerlessness or sometimes both combined, of the whole engagement with politics, with national politics, with international politics, with political institutions, with international political and legal bodies. They all serve colonial interests, they serve power, and it's all very justified. But we have to understand that if we don't have institutes also on the global level, we will not be able to respond to the challenge that we face now. We will not be able to respond to the challenge of stopping the genocide in Gaza. We will not be able to respond to the fascist takeover that we're experiencing here in the US, and we will not be able to respond to what's coming in the coming decades very, very soon. So if we go back and we understand that mobilization on the ground in the fall of 2023 played a role in starting this really unprecedented change of the international legal system, the charge of genocide against Israel in the International Court of Justice, and then arrest warrants in the ICC. And there's other things that we can say actually about international law in this, but we don't have time to go into it. Then we understand that there are ways that mobilization on the ground that is driven sometimes by anger at these international bodies, and very justified anger, can help also change them. And we need this change. Obviously, as is clear, I have some critique about the way that we've been organizing and mobilizing, but I also think that if anything, we need more of it. And in order to have more of it, we need more collaboration, more alliances. These are challenges we're facing. And of course, this is the last thing I'll say about this. We're facing, it's incredibly scary times. And there's a lot of fear, and very justified in various ways. Fear to one's own safety, fears to people's losing their jobs. I have a daughter, she's 12-year-old. People always say, oh, my children, I love my children. I'll do anything for my children. If we're serious about this, the challenges that we face in our children's lifetime, for sure, we have to do everything for them. It's much more scary, actually, to think what will happen if we don't mobilize, if we don't take the risks. And there are risks, and it is scary. But it's more scary to think that our future is Israel's destruction of Gaza. That's far more scary.
Thank you so much, Raz. I am looking at the time and I could talk to you for hours. As we close out, if there's been anything on your mind that you feel like we didn't speak to, which was many things we didn't speak to, but if there was anything that you wanted to make sure that listeners who primarily are based in the United States and are concerned about stopping a consolidation of fascism, anything else that you think people need to be thinking about or acting on right now?
I would just, again, stress the point that people need to understand, as you said, actually, what's happening now. The struggle is not to go back to before this current Trump presidency. The struggle is not to go back to actually before the first Trump presidency. The struggle is not just, it is also to stop the genocide in Gaza. I mean, there's so many other cases that we can think about, Myanmar's genocidal assault against the Rohingya. There's 1 million Rohingya in the most horrific refugee camps in Cox's Bazar on the border between Bangladesh and Myanmar, for example. There's so many things that we can think about. Immediate struggles. So yes, immediately stopping the genocide. But the struggle is not just about this. So it's not just about going back to before the 7th of October 2023. Not just about, if only it was Kamala Harris who won the election. The struggle is really about coming to terms with how we got here. So what I call this not post-Holocaust world in the last 80 years, and what we need to do in order to create a completely different kind of world for the vast majority of people. We have a very small minority of people around the world, actually, who have an interest in the kind of structural systemic violence that is visited on more and more people, actually, and is threatening everyone on this planet. We are the majority, and we have an interest from different points of view, and here we get into, so I would really urge people to think that the struggle is not just going back to kind of, a comfortable liberal position, perhaps, that you could imagine. That's not loving your children, in other words. That's not really ensuring the future of our children in this world. That's what I would urge people to think about. How we get to a year and a half of Israel's genocide in Gaza. How do we get to Trump's assault on our constitution in this way? Means that we have to come to terms with things that are not secret, but we have been very comfortably pushing to the sides, marginalizing, disavowing, denying. And then we have to understand we have to come together, cross our many differences wherever we can to continue the struggle, which is ongoing, and intensify the struggle to understand that we are facing forces that are the minority in this world, but who want to destroy our lives and this planet. It's a broader struggle. This really cuts across left, right, Republicans, Democrats. This is for most people around us.
I want to thank you so much, Raz, for sharing your time, your insights, your expertise, your perspectives with us. And for listeners who want to connect with you, with your work, is there any place you want to direct people to go to?
I mean, it's easy to find me online. I teach at Stockton University in New Jersey, and it's easy to find my Stockton University email if people want. Many have done that in the past. But again, once people really raise their head a bit and look around and come to terms with where we are on the local level, on the state level, on the international level, in their communities, they'll find so many people who are concerned and doing all kinds of stuff to connect in various ways to these struggles that are related to each other, about the environment, about Gaza, about fascism here, about mass incarceration, about so many border issues. As we know, a lot of this fascism is expressed outright for a long time before the second Trump administration. So people really have to get out of their individual selves. And if they want to find what to do, they'll find what to do. It's everywhere. I mean, your podcast, Fuse Fascism, is one example, for example, but there's so many people who care and so many struggles. But yes, if people want to find me, it's easy to find me.
Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Sam.
Before closing today's episode, I wanted to share from Mahmoud Khalil's letter to his newborn son, published by The Guardian. To my newborn son, I am absent not out of apathy, but conviction. Mahmoud wrote, Yabadeen, it has been 2 weeks since you were born, and these are my first words to you. In the early hours of 21 April, I waited on the other end of a phone as your mother labored to bring you into this world. I listened to her pain breaths and tried to speak comforting words into her ear over the crackling line. During your first moments, I buried my face in my arms and kept my voice low so that the 70 other men sleeping in this concrete room would not see my cloudy eyes or hear my voice catch. I feel suffocated by my rage and the cruelty of a system that deprived your mother and me of sharing this experience. Why do faceless politicians have the power to strip human beings of their divine moments? I encourage you to read the rest of Mahmoud Khalil's letter linked in the show notes. Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. Take action with us this week. Everyone who can be in DC on Thursday. Protest at the U.S. Supreme Court, 9 a.m. Hands off birthright citizenship. Trump must go now. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. Again, if you can't be in DC, take action wherever you are and everywhere. On Saturday, May 17th, join protests nationwide to put the demand Trump must go now everywhere. Visit refusefascism.org or see the show notes to find a protest near you, or sign up to host an action if you don't see one in your area. Want to support the show? Amazing. Support the imperative and support the show by getting merch or join our Patreon community to fuel refusal of this fascist nightmare. Visit patreon.com/refusefascism or make a one-time donation via refusefascism.org. Just hit that donate button, or to Venmo the show, refuse-fascism. Or for $0, share the show with others, rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, or comment on our socials or YouTube. It really makes a difference and is so appreciated. Of course, connect with us on social media at Refuse Fascism, including on Blue Sky, and find us on TikTok at Refuse Fascism, where fascism is FASHISM, because TikTok has some messed up rules. As always, thanks to Richie Marini, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tinkelman for helping produce this episode. Until next Sunday, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.